This is Leadership Beyond, your community of conversation.
But this is the first time in my professional career that everybody, 100% of us, are consciously aware we are engaged in the change initiative.
Yeah, everything. I mean, COVID caused us all to go through change, right? At the same time, but our experiences were so different.
Facing these unprecedented times in isolation is pure insanity. Good morning, Karen. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Well, when Adrienne and I were first doing the series Reimagining HR, you came to mind because I told Adrienne you were reimagining HR before it was even a thing. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, Tom and Adrienne, you know me, but for the purpose of your audience, I'll get into a little bit more. I'm the principal of my own firm. It's called Co-Design of Work Experience. I'm the author of a book called Culture Your Culture, Innovating Experiences at Work. I'm the founder of a future of work platform called A New HR. It's a side passion project of mine. I'm an executive coach, and then I am also an instructor at Stanford University Continuing Studies. Now, my main purpose is to enable decision makers to address organizational challenges that affect business results. And I do this in four main buckets. One is in coaching and developing leadership. The second is enabling organizations to leverage their culture, diversity, and employee experience. The third is optimizing talent by aligning people with strategy for results. And the fourth, which kind of cuts across all of the others, but is also a huge body of work, which is driving change management and transformation. So that's where I spend most of my time.
Well, when I hear that, I think, and this is my own bias, that the real thing that pulls those buckets together is this thing called culture. So I'm going to ask you, what in the world is culture, and what does it have to do with reimagining HR?
So I say culture is the thing behind everything, right? So it's anything, it's a social construct, but it is anything that has the power to affect or influence perceptions, behaviors, mindsets, etc. So it's the operating system, the how behind all human interactions from my perspective. I'm obviously very biased toward focusing on culture. But I think I'm backed up by a ton of personal experiences. All of us have experienced good and bad cultures in our career, and there's plenty of case studies out there. And if you read the news, I'm sure there's something headlining today, and it doesn't matter which day you check, because there's always something that talks about the culture somewhere influencing whether it's a good outcome or a not so good outcome. And so that's why I say a lot of times, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that says this, is that whether or not an organization pays attention to its culture, they are choosing culture either as an asset or liability. Okay, so even if no one pays attention, culture still exists. It's still there every day, still affecting everything. And so my work is about helping people learn and be empowered, even at the individual level, to make a difference when it comes to their culture, because everyone wants to have the good and not less of the bad, right? So isn't that the purpose of all of our work?
That creates so many questions in my mind.
Really?
I think with good questions, though, I mean, things that I've been thinking about and talking with others around exactly what you said, that culture seems to be the little things that we do, right? We put the statements on the wall, but what drives the culture are the ways that you show up, your behaviors in the meetings and in the conversations in the hallway. And those very small, minute actions are the things that create the culture. Mm-hmm. And so it's great to hear you say that, and that you're working so diligently to help shape this, because I feel like there's this conundrum of if we can say the words, we can say all the right things, but it's how are we driving those behaviors to either establish or reinforce what we're saying we want in our culture. How do you
Right.
do that?
Yeah. So culture shows up in lived experience. So what we're talking about in behavior, those day-to-day behaviors, they contribute to patterns of behaviors, and those patterns of behaviors reflect the culture. And it's a symbiotic relationship, right? So you pair that with everything that's in the context, and there you have it. You have your culture. So how do you shape it? Well, that's why I wrote my book. I had a frustration, and Tom's heard this before, that as much as we bring up everything in the name of culture, there's nothing that really went beyond this is good or bad archetypes, right? Or these are good or bad things to do. And so I went about developing this framework called Design of Work Experience to provide the step-by-step how-to for culture, because there was nothing around building that capability as an organization. And by the way, I mean, that's why I said starting at the individual level, because we need to make sure that everyone feels they don't feel like their culture is happening to them. And that often happens. Like, how can I change it? It's just happening to me. And I believe that's something that people need to have permission to get directly involved in, because we're all contributing to, reflecting, influencing through our own presence in these organizations. So there's a lot individuals can do so. And you need, by the way, when you change culture, that level of saturation within an organ. If you're going to change things, it's got to hit at the individual, the team, and the organizational level. So Design of Work Experience, and I shorten it as an acronym, DOWE, and pronounce it DEWE. And you'll have to read till the last page of the book to understand why I pronounce it that way. But it really is intended to empower and to enable organizations and their people to be able to create, implement, change, and sustain cultures that help their business and their people thrive. And so I'm happy to share a lot more about the framework if there's interest. But I encourage people to at least think through it and pull through the concepts and understand, if we want different results, we have to do different things. And we know right now, today, it's not where we want it to be.
Well, several of my colleagues in human resources complain that they would love to be seen more as business partners and less as operational doers, not doer in your acronym sense, but pair of hands, or experts, but not true collaborators. And so as we reimagine human resources, and I will quote you from a previous interview, you said, oftentimes human resources has become mired down in operational actions and have become less people-centered. So as we reimagine HR, I would like you to comment on both of those things, people-centered and business partners.
Yeah. Yes, and I still believe that, even though it's been a few years. So the people-centered piece, you got to think back to what's the purpose of HR? Why does HR exist? And I think some of that thinking has not gone into because it's almost as an assumption these days that HR exists in the organization. No one questions why it's there. And so it's just getting back to the fundamentals of, what purpose does it serve an organization, and what value can it bring to the people that they collaborate with. So what's great is technology is helping us to manage the operational aspects or the transactions of the organization a lot better than they did years ago, right? And that's only going to continue to evolve. What that means is then that leaves the human-centered work to us humans, right? And HR, as you reimagine it, it has to be unique to the organization. Yes, it's a field of practice. Yes, there is a lot of knowledge to be shared across organizations. But when you look at HR, it's the same as when you design a culture. It has to be context driven. And today it does happen organically, but not optimized in a way that's optimized, right? So I think every organization needs to make sure they revisit the role HR plays in the organization, its purpose, be able to leverage efficiencies so that HR is not wasting its time. I can tell you, like, I came from HR, and I remember sitting there looking at spreadsheets with a ruler and saying, they're paying me a lot of money to do this, and not what I'm supposed to be doing, right? So let's take advantage of making that function more efficient and effective, even moving it out of HR. Like, I would challenge people to consider, do we have to create HR to be what it's always been? Because, that the famous, what got you here isn't going to take you there, right? So clean slate it. Take a look at what role it wants to play in the organization, or it needs to play. And when it's business partnership, it's about that relationship. It's about the co-creation. And, we've talked about that seat at the table for as long as I've been in the workforce.
Yep.
And I don't know if that's the right question. Yeah, I don't know if that's the right question. And I'm going to challenge organizations to think about what their fundamental questions are, because it's not the same across every company.
Do you have an example in the work that you've done, or the work that you've helped organizations get through? Do you have an example of a successful transformation where it's been done? Like, I have seen it in pockets of organizations where they're fairly successful in starting to shift some of the HR responsibilities down, to the managers and to the employees. But on the big scale, they still get stuck. And it's still, HR is still seen as that transactional ticket taker when it comes to payroll and performance reviews, right? Just do this, right? Here we are again, performance cycle. Like, let me tell you how to do these things, rather than being that partner through those cycles. So do you have an example where you've seen success, a successful kind of transformation, and what does that look like, and how did they get there?
Oh gosh, there's so much to say to what you just
Loaded question, I know.
I'm trying to break it up and then be able to fully answer your question. So bear with me here. So first of all is there have been successes. The challenge has been in sustainability, right? All right. From my experience, it even starts down to the individual HR partner. And this is where I'm going to take a book from my coaching. And that is, when people come to me and they say, how do I change people's perceptions about me as a leader? They're worried about reputation, and they're thinking, oh yeah, the capability that we need to develop is, something reputational or executive presence or something like that. And the reality is, reputation is built on relationship. So if you want to change the reputation, you got to change the relationship. So that goes back to the previous question is, if HR wants to transform the role it plays in the organization, it has to change the relationship. And just like anything, when it comes to cultural patterns that you're trying to break, when one party changes, everyone else they interact with has to respond differently. So that change has to begin with HR. If they want to be the ones that drive change, then they have to initiate it. So that's one. The other thing is, yes, I have heard some success stories, or I've been a part of success stories where the digital transformation of HR is a game changer. Any sort of major initiative is a great excuse to look at the holistic picture, right? Because if you're doing a digital transformation, how does that change the workflows, the behaviors, the relationships around them? So it's not just the digital transformation itself.
Right.
It's far
the whole
broader.
model.
Yeah, absolutely. Does that answer your question?
Well, I interrupted you there, but you just reminded me of something very powerful. Is it okay, Adrienne? I don't want to.
Yeah, please. Yep.
Just just, it's so obvious, and you have this ability to state something that should be obvious, and I just never looked at it this way. And so thank you for that. And what I'm talking about is culture is dynamic, and much of culture is habitual.
Yeah.
So we don't see that it's dynamic, and that's why we're seeing in the broader sense in the political, it's like overnight it's a whole different thing, but it really isn't. And if we aren't, I don't even know if you use the word stepping back and looking at the whole picture, and hybrid work, like digital, is impacting the relationship, the workflow. And so you said that there were breakthroughs and that they weren't necessarily sustainable. And if relationships are dynamic, then that's obvious, and yet it's often not in the equation. How is this, whatever this is, impacting our culture? Because I work with a company that has one of the best corporate culture for the right people. And they often talk about how good it is. But then I talk to some people that bought into this company because of the culture, and you use the word work experience. Their experience is so far removed from that culture. And it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's that somehow it hasn't gotten to where they're onboarding.
Well, it's about intentional management of that culture. And so if people are, there's a comparison between, you want to have a core experience that is consistent no matter where you are in the organization. And then you want to leave the rest that's so wonderful about diversity, right? And so when it's not intentionally managed, then you get inconsistency. And what that creates is honestly an erosion of trust, because then it's a difference between what is said and what people experience and live every day. And so that becomes a bigger problem over time. The other thing you mentioned earlier, I think it's not even just taking a step back, it's paying attention all the time.
Yes.
Right? Because when you look at when things, let's say proverbially, hit the fan, is that it almost seems like it happened overnight. You were caught unaware or unprepared as an organization, and then you wonder how it got there, right? And what it is that there were a lot of chances along the way to course correct. There were a lot of hints. It's just that they weren't paying attention. Now, the good news is, starting today, you have the opportunity to do better, right? And to be intentional and to lead a transformation and to sustain it so that you have opportunities tomorrow to do better. The challenge is making sure that that's a continuous journey, as opposed to, and you talk about culture initiatives, the same with DEI initiatives, is that people feel there's a start and an end or finish to a project.
It's not a thing that you put a check in and do the culture thing already.
And then they wonder, well, how come we didn't sustain it? Because you didn't sustain it.
Yeah.
Right?
I see that with most change programs I've been a part of, right? When you get there, you did the thing, you made the change, maybe you got people across the finish line, and then you go, okay, great, we're there. Let's move on to the next change. It's like, well, wait, hang on. How are we going to make sure that they stay there, right? And that they stay there in a good place, in an engaged way, and in a way that they can be productive and effective, not taking their small steps back to the old way. And when you're talking culture changes, it's even more important to continue to nurture and reinforce we got there, let's stay there. Because it's not as easy as, well, they can't go back to the system we turned off, the technical system we turned off, right? No, you can go back to your old way of doing things very, very easily. Right. And it's that point of habitual, right? Like it's those habits. And I think it's very brave of organizations when they are embarking on, they know they need to make a change, right? Something in their culture has gone wrong. Yeah. They start to figure out what it is. And where I see the real bravery come in is when they find, it could be individuals who have come in or one individual or a group of individuals have started to pick away at the culture that was designed from the beginning, right? And again, it's a subtle thing where, oh, you don't think this one leader coming in could chip away at a culture.
Mm-hmm.
And years later, you look back and maybe you can see that looking back, oh, it's the behaviors of this group who's then hired these people, and right. And now it's grown. And all of a sudden you look back and your culture is not at all what you intended for it to be. The bravery is identifying that and doing the hard thing, right?
Yes.
You have to remove the people that maybe caused the issue in the first place.
And that's because I think the broader culture wasn't strong enough to endure beyond that particular leader as well, right? So if you're not managing on top of that, the whole point behind sustainability of cultures becomes interwoven. It has to be so strong that even an individual leader, it supersedes their tenure with the organization. Now, you're right. What they've done is that they've essentially created a new culture. And because the previous culture wasn't being managed or intentionally maintained or evolving, then yes, of course, a new culture could take over as a result of that. So it's about, again, paying attention, because all along the way, even if there's one or two generations of that form of leadership or that culture, how many signals were raised and missed before that? So you're right. It's absolutely brave to start wherever you start today. That's the good thing about this work. You can start today to do better tomorrow, as I said. And so it's not about regrets. It's about making huge impact that's going to make a difference, right? And it's not just because it's the right thing to do, but it's also good for your business as well, right? It's a win-win that people aren't leveraging. And so the companies that can manage to do this, they have a competitive advantage. And we know that it's, even in the worst of economies, there's still a lot of competition for the right talent, right?
And I'd like to go back to, Tom, what you brought up was the hybrid working solution and how that is creating a shift in relationships, which will in turn create a shift in culture, right? And so it's how are you making sure that that shift is where you want it to be? I have been hearing and reading a lot that workers now are calling for leaders who care. Imagine that. Leaders who care. Right? I think we always wanted leaders who cared, right? But it's emphasized now, right? It's really emphasized. And we're talking more about showing up with sympathy and with empathy and that emotional intelligence, and just bringing yourself to, as a human, to the humans that you're working with. And are you seeing this start to grow with hybrid working? Like, are we getting there? You know, I feel like that is a kind of a shift for some leaders where there was a separation between professional and personal self, and right? And the sympathy and the empathy characteristics that you bring, well, that's saved for your friends and your community and your family. But at work, we're business. We talk about the goals and the numbers, and this is what we're doing. And having to shift to bring that in, how do we start to encourage that and to reinforce that with leaders?
Yeah, so let me kind of walk through this sequentially to give you a sense of how I think about things as well. But I do want to speak to that last point about that lack of empathy. And I'm going to point out how many poor decisions have been made on the business side because of a lack of empathy, and they paid for it, right? And so I think empathy is an absolutely essential business skill that is, I think, undervalued and is critical, right? So this separation of work and life is no longer with hybrid, which is not a bad thing, right? Because we're whole people, by the way, right?
It never really existed, but that's for a different conversation.
Absolutely, I agree. That's definitely, and that shift. Let me just So that shift when it first happened was very sudden. No change management, right? It was just had to happen overnight due to very extreme circumstances. Now, what I observed in the beginning was that when work shifted to remote, existing cultures were exacerbated. So that means great cultures had an opportunity to step up and demonstrate why they were great in the first place. So I have seen companies that we knew they were caring before, but they really showed that during this really hard time, right? And that sets a new standard, by the way, right? You kind of can't go back from there. But those that were dysfunctional to begin with, those toxic environments, they didn't get better because you physically weren't next to the problems. They got worse, right? So if communication was poor before, guess what? It was worse online, right? And so there was a little bit of that bifurcation that happened in the beginning, like even more so. And I still hear, honestly, I'm still talking to companies today that said, we really want to work on our culture. We're going to wait till we get back in the office and then we'll get started. And I'm kind of like, all right, couple of things, just a couple of things, it's still happening now, right? And we don't know when we're getting back, if at all, right? Or in what capacity, right? And even, by the way, I'm also working hybrid right now. So who knows how that's all going to work, right? So this waiting for the next thing is just another example of not taking action when you have the opportunity to. So that's what I've seen evolve over the last few years. Now, that being said, this year it's been different. It's been this realization that life must continue, and things need to be done, right? And we talk about the Great Resignation. It's there for a reason. And so when you talk about how do you transition culture, it's still experience. It's still this intentional design of experience. And this is a perfect opportunity to go back and revisit that, because and use the framework. It'll tell you and the three things you need for culture change is a deep understanding of your starting point, the current state. And that goes beyond, by the way, your climate surveys and your employee engagement scores. Mm-hmm. You need to have a deep understanding of the current state and the nuances of the current culture. You need to know where you're going, and you need to get the directions on how to get there. And that's what this framework is intended to do. And so many organizations skip that first step. They go from problem to execution. They don't see strengths. They don't see opportunities. They don't see nuances that are going to cause those solutions to fail. They fail to listen to the voice of those that you expect to implement the changes. All those things have to happen first before you manage that change, if at all, by the way. So speaking of digital transformation, I've had conversations with CHROs. It's like, yeah, we implemented, Workday. Well, how's your change? Well, we didn't do change management. And you know what? 3 or 4 years later, they're still dealing with the fallout, right? So that work up front is so important because the remedial is that much worse. Let me just tell you, it takes that much longer to do. So take your vitamins, people. Don't wait for the painkillers because it's better for you. Hopefully that answers your question, though. If you have any follow-ups, by all means, I'm happy to talk about this all day, honestly.
Well, I would like to dive deeper, but we're almost out of time for this conversation. And what I would like to suggest is, if you're willing, to put together a small expert panel and maybe bring some people in to ask questions about reimagining HR. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'll let you address it any way that you want. But I can start with this assumption, and you can validate it, or you can let it go. But that if you are a leader reimagining HR, you better take leadership and responsibility for culture.
Yes.
And that is a way that you perhaps could give a business partnership in a way that maybe your business partners hadn't even thought that that's the issue. And so I see this opportunity to say, what is our current culture, and how do the recent changes provide an opportunity to improve it, whatever we decide from looking at what's going on. And I also want to say that the number one thing that your book did for me, I didn't realize it till I read it, is I always thought of culture as a thing that happened to you. You know, this is a good culture, this is a bad culture, this team is dysfunctional. All that may be true, but I didn't recognize the ability at every level of the organization to impact, if not the whole culture, a small culture with a couple clients. And so reimagining HR must include being a part of designing a culture, and take that wherever you want.
Yeah, but HR has a very specific role or a number of specific roles to play when it comes to culture, but they don't own it. Everyone owns it. So it is not a solitary exercise. When you talk about, if I need to reimagine HR, I need collaborators and collaborators outside of HR, by the way, right? And so I think that's really important to understand that even though we all have the power to influence, we can't do it alone. No one can take the culture sword and say, yeah, I slayed it, right?
Are you open to a little refinement that's actually agreeing with you, just in language, for clarity of language?
Yeah.
When you take ownership, it doesn't mean you possess it.
That's right.
It means you're responsible for culture. And if you're responsible for culture and you only are looking at yourself, then obviously you don't own it. You need collaborators. So I just want to say I'm totally in sync there.
Oh, well put.
When I use the word own, I certainly didn't mean possess it in any, possessive way, but just to say that I am responsible for my company culture, and some of it is beyond my control, and I certainly need co-conspirators.
Right. And I say that not so much because it's not that HR has a tendency to say that's mine. It's more about company leaders kind of abdicating their responsibility and just throwing it on HR's lap too, right? So it goes both ways. Yeah. So I want to make sure that there's an understanding that if there is genuine, sustainable culture change and management of that culture, it needs to be holistic within the organization. And yet at the same time, it needs to include everyone. It has to give people an opportunity to participate and to influence on in their own spheres of influence, right? So I think there's so much potential that we have in our organizations that can go beyond what we have today. And we just need to build the momentum for that and to make sure that we bring others with us.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Adrienne, any last comments here?
No, thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I look forward to your idea of the panel, Tom. I think that's a great way for us to wrap up this Reimagining HR series and really tie a bow on it, get, summarize all of the different perspectives that we've gotten along the way, and looking forward to the next conversations. Thank you.
Yeah. No, it's all about collaboration. So a panel would be great to put brilliant minds together and see what they create. And so that being said, I've had a year full of projects where I collaborated with others on 3 books that are in the pipeline. So if you don't mind me sharing about what's coming my way,
please
hear it.
They're all in really different spaces too. So that's what made it a very fun year for me as well. So the first book, all collaborations, like I said, is called Mobile Medicine: Overcoming People, Culture, and Governance. And it's really meant to address what's been such a challenge for the healthcare and the pharmaceutical and the biotech industries around digital transformation, evolution of patient care, and organizational effectiveness. So we have covered every single angle that an organization would need to understand as they embark on their next chapter. So I really encourage people to learn from like my co-authors, who were absolutely brilliant. The other is in customer experience. So also very much tied to employee experience, right? Because if you don't have your employee experience down, guess what happens to your customer experience, right? There's so much symbiotic relationship between those spaces. And so it's a book that is coming out in December around CX. And then the third is around change. It's called Transformulation. And Tom is aware that colleagues of ours have come together to write a book to provide the secret sauce for leading transformational change. So it's very apropos to this conversation and this audience. Yes. And that comes out in the first half of 2022. So lots of thought leadership out there. The question is, we know the answers, but can we curate them and execute and sustain them?
Sustain, yeah, I was going to throw that in if you forgot it. And I will put in a plug. Culture, your culture has changed my life forever for the better. And we'll put a link to that book
right here.
That one's available now.
Yes, it's been out. Yes.
It's just so well written for people at any experience level. So Karen has a lot of experience and knowledge and could geek speak. None of that's there. It's what can you do right where you are to impact culture? And I go, wow, I never knew I had. It empowered me, which I know is one of your missions.
Absolutely.
So it's just a wonderful book.
Well, thank you so much. Like I said, I could do this all day, especially with the two of you. So I'm really grateful that we had this opportunity.
Be well, and we'll talk soon, I hope.
You take care.
Thank you.
Bye, Karen.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Beyond podcast. We hope you benefited from this conversation as much as we have. We invite you to join our community of conversation. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Don't forget to sign up at aleadershipbeyond.com for free materials and updates. That's aleadershipbeyond.com. Join us in 2 weeks for our next episode.